Hey folks, I'm Will Jarvis. Along with my dad, Dr. David Jarvis, I host the podcast Narratives. Narratives is a project exploring the ways in which the world is better than it has been, the ways it is worse, and the paths toward making a better, more definite future. I hope you enjoy it. A quick note before we get started. We had some connection issues with Don during the beginning part of our conversation, so we went ahead and recorded an intro to Don's background and the subject matter included here. If you're already familiar with the concepts and Don's background, you can skip to where we start talking to Don at around the 21-minute mark. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribe, tell your friends, or leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. And with that, we'll get started. Good evening.
Okay.
How's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you this evening?
Doing all right.
Good. So tell me, we're kind of interested in this. You've been interested in science productivity for a while. Is that right?
That's right. I've been interested in this issue of science productivity after learning a lot about secular stagnation, tech stagnation, and just seeing what I feel is there seems to be a big difference now between the research coming out and the research and the advancements we made in the 20th century. So it seems like we had all these huge titans in the 20th century. And I've had this thought that, people say things have gotten a lot harder, right? But we still understand so little about the universe. It seems like there would still be many areas where we could make large advancements in just basic research.
Okay, would you just define secular stagnation for us before we go further?
Sure. So we've talked about it a little bit. So secular stagnation is just a condition where there's little or no economic growth. So growth in the U.S. has slowed immensely versus what it has been in the past. And Larry Summers, I believe, coined the term secular stagnation. I think he had a book on it. And I've always thought, growth, this is kind of the Robert Solow model, that, technology is downstream of science, and economic growth is downstream of technological growth. And so my question has always been, it feels like science has slowed down, and what can we do about it? What can we reasonably do about that? And for a while, I thought maybe just the incentives are out of whack, and maybe if we had more research bounties. So I thought about, what if we took a research bounty approach to the problem, where we actually just paid people to try and solve problems that we have. And I was exploring this idea, and I thought, maybe there's a startup here. I don't know. But before I, launched into anything, I wanted to kind of comprehensively read all of the literature that was out there on the subject of science productivity, what's gone wrong exactly, how it's gone wrong. And in that process, I kind of found Don Braben and his book, Scientific Freedom.
Okay, so you think there's a direct correlation between technical productivity and science productivity, which seems reasonable.
That's right. Yeah. So you could imagine that you have to do the basic research on, let's say, electricity before you can get the light bulb.
And then there's probably many ideas that we take as gospel today, science ideas that we take as gospel for today, that are either just wrong, they're not correct, or they're unexplored, and that they're much larger than we think they are. Right.
There always seems to be things that are unexplored. There's this idea of paradigm shifts and the structure of scientific revolutions. They always say, all the old generation has to die out before new ideas can kind of filter through. And there seems to be plenty of, of course, it's difficult to point them out, because if you knew what they were, you'd be working on them presumably. But there's still plenty of secrets left in the universe. There's plenty of things we don't understand. And so that's why I find arguments about things getting harder. They could be slightly harder, but we're also a lot smarter than we used to be, and we have more tools. And so I think that probably balances out at the end of the day.
Yeah, it seems sort of a lazy idea to say things are just harder than they used to be.
Right. Well, and at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? So, like, you
Yeah,
still have
it's
to solve
true.
the problem.
It's
That's not an excuse to work less hard, I would say.
and that seems to there seems to be this question that involved with this, that there were all these giants, scientific giants that we know about, that came up these big ideas, and then they suddenly seem to have collapsed, and we feel like we don't have those um, giants with big ideas anymore.
Yeah,
So
definitely. What happened to all the weird people with the good ideas? They
yeah.
all seem to be gone. You even see this recently. There was a case where a scientist at Harvard, I believe it was a chemist, and they found out he was selling secrets to China, military secrets, and so they put him in federal prison, as you do. And it was striking to me because he was always dressed up in a suit. He has these pictures of him at Harvard, and he's always in a suit. And it's a really weird thing. There's no sartorial rules here hard sartorial rules we should follow, but it is notable that, he's not, a wacky guy in a lab coat. He's kind of like dressed up like this salesman. It's really interesting.
So you've been able to identify sort of a point in time, really where sort of the dinosaurs became extinct, where the giants seemed to, with these blue sky ideas, disappear.
That's right. Well, it's weird. There's a great website. We've talked about it before. It's like, what the heck happened in like 1972 or 1970? It's right around there. Maybe it's 1971. If you look at all the growth curves, they start heading the wrong direction. Then things seem to start stagnating. Then anecdotally, we go to the moon, and then Woodstock happens, and then that's like the classic Peter Thiel line, and then things just kind of like flatline a little bit in terms of growth. And it's really interesting because one of the things we found is kind of this shift to more directed research in 1970. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that strike me. One of the things that struck me after having worked with the background this podcast was, I thought it might be appropriate to call this "You Can't See the Forest Because of the Trees." Because when I started studying basic science was in the early 70s when this shift occurred. And so all the people you studied in basic science then, and probably even today, those big ideas, the ones that Einstein and Rutherford and Planck and all those guys had, preceded just almost, I almost came into studying science when all that ceased. And it never struck me that now for the last 40 or 50 years, none of those big ideas have really, like you said, have occurred. So that's one of the things that struck me about this. And then, so there was something really important that happened about 1970 scientifically, and that was the Apollo mission. It was the getting man to the moon.
That's right. And before we go too much further, we should mention what directed research we mean by directed research. So before 1970, and perhaps earlier even, it was the case that scientists could, you would get your PhD, you get a position, and then you were fairly free to go about and do your research. So you didn't have to go in front of all these grant committees. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough money where you're essentially free to do what you want and explore what you want, which is very different from today, where you have a very robust grant process. And when you have a grant process, it it creates competitive pressures. And on top of the competitive pressures, you have to get good at winning grants to be successful. And when you have to get good at giving grants, um, it's a problem, because how do you select people? Well, you have a jury of their peers. Well, if you have a jury of their peers, and let's say you have a new weird idea that, let's say, kind of invalidates a lot of common knowledge in your given field. By definition, when it's a new idea, you don't have much evidence to back it up, and it's a wacky idea, and so people won't accept it, and you never get off the starting blocks, so to speak. And we started giving grants to try and speed up scientific progress. So if we think about Apollo, and we think about the Manhattan Project, we think of these giant kind of government run military industrial complex projects, which were very good in that you were able to speed up scientific progress immensely in the short term. But I think the long run effect is that it's not a sustainable progress. Like, you can do that once, you can do that maybe twice, but after you do that, you need to go back to this kind of other mode, because you can speed things up, but when things get super bureaucratized in order to make things happen, I'm reading a book by General Groves. He was the Army Corps of Engineers brigadier general who managed the Manhattan Project, and he was awesome at it. He did a really good job. But he did have to force everyone to, each person had, you need to solve this specific problem and you have this deadline. And it was this really incredible management problem to kind of get it pushed through. But if you kind of have that process and you expand it out over time, I think it works less well. That makes
And,
sense.
it's not directed research can work very well. We've got the perfect example of that today in the coronavirus vaccines. We task science with coming up with vaccines, and there's two novel technologies, the mRNA technologies, that have proven probably to produce several of the best vaccines, most effective vaccines we've ever had.
Yeah.
So it's not that you can't solve problems that way. It's just that you also need some balance, we think, and what the giants, the dinosaurs of the past did when they just had these passions for different subjects and devoted their lives to them and formed the basis, the foundation, a lot of the current foundation of what we understand about the world.
That's right. And I think there's a difference between, let's say, sprinting to create a vaccine, which we kind of know, like, we know what vaccines are, we understand the concept, and inventing the concept of a vaccine. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
Even though it is like it's an advancement, but the difference, the advancement of the COVID-19 vaccine is still small compared to coming up with a vaccine. Period. You see what I'm saying?
And it seems like in when we started pursuing solving problems with research, directed research, which that works well. And in doing that, we sort of abandoned the blue sky research where and we need both because we need to still discover and understand the world better than we did, which is the basis for other types of research like vaccine research or space exploration, um, other energy exploration. So you need both, and we've sort of abandoned one in our pursuit of the other.
Yeah, and even then, like, so directed research is more like, I have this problem and I'll pay someone to solve it, if that makes sense. And blue skies research is more like, well, we're going to go explore the universe and try and solve these mysteries, um, which is, I think, part of the problem and reason why we stopped was, there's an explosion of universities. We produce quite a few more PhD candidates than we did in the past. They're much less effective, I think, because there are so many. You have to be much more guarded against abuse, if that makes sense. And there's a lot more people competing, which creates competitive pressure. And then you have to figure out how to divvy up the funds because there's not enough spots. There's a glut of researchers, and how do you determine who gets what? If
And it
that makes
seems
sense.
part of our problem is that and when we have directed problem solving, when we can identify the problem, that's fine. But there's a lot of problems that you have that you don't know that you have them because you don't know enough to understand the subject. And that's
That's
what undirected research does. The blue sky, the venture research answers those questions like what do you not know? What problems do you have because you don't simply understand nature?
that's right. And I think it's very important. Do you remember the Rumsfeld speech? It's like known knowns, unknown knowns,
Yes.
unknown unknowns. It is one of those problems. Like, we don't know, and when we talked to Don, that was a big thing. You're not sure what's out there because by definition these things are they're hard to find. They're not always readily apparent, and like Don will mention, Max Planck worked for 20 years on one problem, and to think that someone could do that today is just kind of, it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable to think some researcher could just sit down and like think about one problem for 20 years.
But there's an entire subset of wonderful minds, great minds that have just this natural curiosity, and they tend to be the most creative people.
Right.
They come up with these big ideas that we don't even think about, and to use them for directed research seems like a waste of resources to me.
It is, but also I think one of the big takeaways I got just in talking to Don, and I've thought this for a while, especially in relation to Blue Skies research, there are not that many of these people, if that makes sense. So, because you have to be in the right place, you obviously have to be smart. You have to have the right perspective and the right ideas. And the people that truly make kind of transformative discoveries like Einstein, Planck, Teller, you name it, they're few and far between. Does that make sense? It's not everyone that can do this. And I've actually listened, I've heard people ask, Don, well, couldn't everyone be like this? Wouldn't this be great? And the truth is it's not for everyone, right? Because his approach is, okay, we're going to find smart people and we're going to fund them to freely pursue their problems. And there are few people that can do that themselves, right? That are self-directed enough to go out and keep exploring and figuring things out. And but although I think we could all benefit from a little bit of that. I don't know.
I wonder if part of the reason we think this is because we don't cultivate what the talent that we have. For instance, not everyone could be a truly artistic stoneworker or painter or musician. You have to have a passion for something, and you have to have some natural gifts. That's probably what you derive your passion from, is just an intense love or caring of something. So we don't really cultivate it that much. So it's hard to say that these people aren't out there, because they have a very different, there's a very limited opportunity for them.
That's right. So I guess, well, and it's also just in the case of Blue Skies research, as we found out just talking to Don, there aren't, there's only so many Einsteins, there's only so many Max Plancks, right? And the important thing is selecting the right people. Like it really is important to find these people and get the right people, the resources they need. And it's not very much money, but it's something we've gotten very bad at, and it's incredible. All the weirdos have been selected out. It's like an evolutionary process. So we're about to talk to Don. Can you tell me a little bit about Don?
Don has an interesting scientific background, but he really enters into our story when he went to work with BP, British Petroleum, and they were starting a venture research division. And we got to talk to Don from London the other morning before the sun rose.
That's right. UK time.
And he's a very interesting person. You probably want to give him a little more background about the book that he wrote that we read.
That's right.
And then we can cut to Don.
That's right. So Don originally, Don Braben, PhD, I ought to add, he had this idea that and realized that scientific freedom was incredibly important, and that things had gotten so bureaucratized, especially with peer review. Long story short, he ends up at BP, and they ask him to, help create a research unit, a new research unit. And so he came up with this idea of venture research, which is really interesting. And like we've talked about it, and Don will explain it here in a little bit. And venture research is giving money to the right people and giving them complete freedom. And it's usually small amounts of money, and not directing them. He would talk with them. He'd go, David, what is your project? What are you interested in? And anyone could call. So, I could call, I'm not a scientist, but I could say, I've got this brand new, let's say energy source. It's potatoes. If you rub potatoes together, it creates like nuclear fusion. And this is great. And he'd go, that's great, Will. Well, how do the potatoes create nuclear fusion? And I would go, well, I don't know. And he's like, okay, well, you're a quack. He's like, if you ever figure it out, Will, give me a call back. He never says no. I think that's a really interesting thing he does. He always just says, well, and it's a great selection mechanism, right? So instead of just aggressively culling, he always leaves the ball back in your court. And I think that's really important because when you're first, working on ideas, it really helps you germinate those thoughts, and he doesn't discourage people as well. And his alt point is also you can tell if someone is full of it, so to speak. Anyway, so Don, he starts this at BP. It's incredibly successful. Do you have any of the numbers? I can't remember how many. Let's see, venture research success.
One of the things I called Don's attention to, which we'll get to, and speaking with him, is that Stephen Davies was one of the projects or investigators that they funded. And as I understand it, they would give them $100,000 the first year, then they would sit down and review them after a year and refund them. So they didn't just fund them for 10 years, they refunded them every year. Isn't that correct?
So what they did was they supported venture researchers for 3 years at a time. Support could be renewed, and often was. On renewal, they just asked themselves whether what they were doing was still challenging. Some programs ran for 9 years or so. So, sometimes they could keep getting extended. And it was incredibly, incredibly successful. And in the show notes, I'll include, there's too many to count, the kind of advancements that everyone in the venture research program came up with, but a huge percentage of them were successful. And the amount of money spent was so tiny compared to, let's say, the total U.S. research budget, federal research budget. It will quite frankly blow your mind. So I'll include some notes to that, and we'll roll the tape.
Okay.
Our conversation starts with Don discussing pioneering venture research in the early days at BP.
I started in 1980 with a completely empty office and with no excuse at having, if I were to fail in the future. I couldn't blame anyone because I had complete freedom. I could do anything I liked. So I derived a strategy of looking for people who would radically change the way we think about an important field. And that became venture research. So that is the guiding philosophy which guides everything we've done since then, to look for researchers who would radically change the way we think about an important field. But still, we decided not to advertise. The wrong people would apply if we advertised. So I went round the universities, first of all in Britain, then in Europe, then in the States. I spent 3 weeks in the States, exhaustingly to 21 universities in 3 weeks, giving talks about venture research and inviting proposals. People could come and propose. Well, most of them just come as a meal ticket and just tried their latest whiz idea on me. Anyway, we did find 2 or 3 people from the first visit, that I met, and they turned out to be really good people. So that's how venture research came about, and that's more or less. It's pretty vague, I didn't, sit down and deliberate. But it took 2 years for it to, or a few years for the precise, for what we should do and how we should do it. Now, we are not looking at virgin territory here. We've had in the 20th century, there were lots of people who did what they wanted to do. But since the start of the century, about 1970, the government changed governments everywhere changed the rules, over a period, because they expanded the number of universities for political reasons and the number of university academics. So up till about 1970, academics everywhere more or less had total freedom. In other words, universities had an amount of money which they more or less doled out equally among their faculty, and the faculty could do anything they liked so long as their requirements were modest. And that harvest, the harvest from that was the Planck Club. In fact, that's how people like Max Planck, who worked for 20 years on his work, 20 years. Thermodynamics, at the end of the 19th century, nobody thought it was worth bothering with. It was not important. Why the hell are you wasting your time with that? They told him. But then he made his monumental discovery, and he radically, absolutely, dramatically changed the way everything was done, and set the pattern for the 20th century. So I named this club, this collection of scientists, after Max Planck, and it includes Einstein, Dirac, Rutherford, and all the other people who came after him. All the people who made radical changes to what their field. But nowadays, of course, because of the increase in the number of academics, then governments had to find, or funding agencies, I should say, because governments don't really control research, but funding agencies do. They changed the rules. Now, academics are noted for their individuality. You would expect each country to have a different arrangement, but they all have identical arrangements. Every country in the world has identical arrangements. They all insist that when a researcher has an idea for a research, he then writes it up. He's got to write it up and send it to them, and they then send it to his competitors to ask them what they think about it. I'm putting I'm putting an edge on this, of course. They don't see it quite like that, but that's what it does turn out to be. That the people doing the judging are in direct competition with those being judged. Maybe not at that time, but sooner or later they will be. And scientists are people, so they will never miss an opportunity of getting the boot in, on somebody. It's all done anonymously. They can say what they like. They only have their reputation to consider. So that is the universal method that the funding agencies ask the opinions of scientists with the most relevant experience in that field, and which means their competitors, of course, and then they make their judgments. Success rates, overall success rates in this process are 25%. And universities, by the way, have their own arrangements. When you have, before you send it off, you've got to get the university's permission. So they have committees to look at what you're doing, and decide whether or not they will forward it. It's ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. But nobody will criticize it publicly, because if they criticize it, then when they come to write proposals themselves, then this will be remembered, and at least that's what they think, and so it affects what is done. So it's a bit of a mess, actually. So anyway, we set out in 1980 to do our thing. We got 10,000 proposals over the 10 years. That's about 1,000 a year. Which a small group, a group of 2 or 3 scientists, more or less, these were recruited from BP. So BP gave me their high flyers, you know, they're people destined for high office in the organization, and I had them for 2 or 3 or 4 years. I even had the offer of the future chairman, John Brown, but I was outbid. I could only offer him a grade 12, and BP Gas offered him grade 14. So I'm rambling on. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, Don, this is
where are we up to?
This is great. So you mentioned kind of a bit briefly about your selection process and how it differs from the current peer review process for selecting projects and funding projects. How would you select these people? I know you said you would go to the universities, you would talk to people. You know, how do you find someone with a transformative idea? Is it just a feel thing where you talk to someone, you go back and forth, and you get an idea for their problems, and they
Well,
and I don't know, what's that like?
Well, that's an interesting question. You don't know, of course, when you meet someone for the first time, whether they're going to be a venture researcher in our definition. So you just have to talk to them. Now, when people used to come to us, at least half of them thought we were looking for getting oil out of the ground, you know. That what we were doing was related to BP's mainstream activities. Now, BP has a research director, John Cadogan, he was at the time, and his budget was more than 2 billion, 2,000. But well, it was never mentioned, but it was only 1 or 2 or 3 million. You know, it was microscopic compared with his. Now, he was responsible for BP's general health. So in determining our strategy, I determined a strategy that would not compete with him, you know, or with anybody else in the world. That was, I was determined that we should be known as the venture research unit, you know, because all other companies look to universities for ideas, but they all were related to their business activities. What we were looking for is completely for ideas out with those specifications. So we'd get them to talk about, so having disabused them, so to speak, of that fact, we started to talk to them. You got to get them to relax. So you talk about the weather or football or whatever you like, and you slowly work around to what they really want to do. The point is trust. Unless the researchers trust you, they will not tell you what they really want to do. Unless we trust them, we're not really, then they were to use the money as they implied that they would, then the system would fail. So there must be mutual trust. And so we started from the outset to develop that trust. And in developing that trust, then their ideas slowly emerged. With some people, like Bennett and Heslop Harrison, for example, that happened in 10 minutes because their research director, when he introduced me to them, he said, I would support what they want to do, but what they want to do, he was then the director of the Plant Breeding Institute. What they want to do is so far out with what we are able to support, you know, and indeed any research council, any single research council in Britain would be unable to support, that we can't do it. And that took me 10 minutes to make up my mind. I determined then that we must support this, and you know, more or less promised them then that we would support it. Now, I had a board to convince, of course, you know, so that was quite something. But anyway, we did get them the support within 6 months. And they did some revolutionary work.
So Don, do you think it was helpful to have a smaller budget and that you weren't forced to try and allocate the capital? You could kind of naturally let it progress and find the right people, make sure it was the right people that you were kind of directing money towards?
Well, the problem is priorities. when you start a venture research activity, you have to have absolute selection criteria. That is what the Planck Club have. They should not be influenced by any fashion, by anything going on today. Now, once you've decided on what you will support, you will have to support every single proposal you hear about that meets those criteria. So you can't decide in advance how big your venture research proposal will be. It will probably be very small. I mean, in BP, for 10 years at least, I was never limited by the budget because I didn't even think about it. This was one of the first issues that the researchers coming to us in London or indeed in anywhere at all, they wanted to know how much money we had. And I said, don't ask that question. What you must assume is we have an infinite amount of money and you can do anything you like. One guy called Rakula from CERN proposed that we build 2 intersecting rings, gigantic rings of proton accelerators, thousands of miles in diameter around the Earth, looking for proton neutrino interactions. It was just ridiculous. It would cost billions. He said, well, what's that to BP? We turned him down, of course. Well, we didn't actually. He went away. It was a joke.
Got it.
So, but back to your serious question, you must support every single proposal that seems to meet your criteria. So that means you have more or less about 1, 2, 3, 4 a year for our small unit. And so we carried out a sort of how could you describe it? An experimental activity in venture research, and we would hope that other people would learn from it. Other oil companies said, we will have to set up our own venture research activity, but we will have to suit it to our requirements. This is what Exxon said, because I happened to Dudley Hirschbach, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and we supported him. He was also an advisor to Exxon, and he went to BP and said, why don't you do this? And that's what they told him. We would have to adjust it to suit our requirements. Well, that I knew that I wouldn't have to worry about Exxon ever again. And that's the problem today. If we go to people, they must decide to support any research that offers to radically change the way we think about something important.
Interesting.
Without priority. You must not have priorities. That's the killer. The killer today is priorities. And who sets the priorities? The scientists, the scientists chosen by the funding agencies. It's a bizarre situation. You have people writing proposals, radically challenging conventional wisdom, and some of the people responsible for defining what conventional wisdom is are chosen to be the referees for these proposals.
Interesting. So Don, I'm curious. There seems to be tension between. I'm reading a book about General Groves, the Army Corps of Engineers general who managed the Manhattan Project. It's his autobiography about the project, and there seems to be tension between, directing work directly at objectives to kind of hyper speed things up versus the process of discovery and doing the things like the Planck Club, like Max Planck did, where he takes 20 years to go explore a subject. And it seems like we've got too much objective chasing and not enough just empowering people with scientific freedom to go explore the ideas that they're interested in. Do you think that's a real effect? That's a real trend?
Well, it's essential when somebody coming up with a venture research proposal, will almost certainly contain a theoretical element, a substantial theoretical element, a new substantial theoretical element, which no one has yet come across. And so this more or less guarantees that his peers will not agree, because because it's a new theory, not tested, and can be dismissed. You know, you just have to listen to what they're saying, what the scientist is saying, and whether or not you believe them. Credibility is everything. Well, with trust, of course, you know, it's less of a problem, because if you trust somebody, you don't always ask, is he credible? Because you trust them. And it isn't easy. And sometimes well, not sometimes, apart from Bennett and Hasler Harrison, most people, we took about 6 months or even a year to make up our minds. But we were always honest with people. We always told them at the end of each meeting, well, we're not quite yet convinced of what you want to do. Would fit our definition of venture research. But if you might want to consider what we've said at our meeting and come back. And that's what they did. I mean, so we were testing their perseverance, if you like, their dedication, because you've got to be dedicated. You know, if you, it's no good, you know, and people often suggest, you know, but surely you can easily be hoodwinked by people who say, you know, thermodynamics doesn't work. And so I had a simple way of dealing with such people. You believe what they say. You say, okay, thermodynamics is rubbish. What's the next step?
Right.
Well, that is the killer question.
They don't call you back.
They never could answer that, you see. So I didn't have to worry about them.
That's great. That's really interesting. Don, do you think research has gotten more difficult just on the level of our, you know, finding out new things about nature, or is it truly just the human problem of getting the right people, the resources to make the right discoveries?
Oh, it's not that. You've got to be a scientist for a start. You've got to be trained as a scientist, and you've got to spend 10 years or certainly a number of years doing mainstream research. But before you can come across an idea that radically challenges that, so you've just got to give time for that process to take place. I don't know what else to say. I mean, each of the people we spoke to, we just talked to them about what they really wanted to do, and eventually you get, you know, there were at each meeting there would be 2 or 3 of them and about 2 or 3 of us, you know, on a little round table in London, and after a certain time, it would become obvious to us, that is, you know, our 2 or 3, that these people were venture researchers. We never had to discuss it.
Interesting.
You know, because what they were wanting to do was so radical, and we believed they could do it. We sometimes visited the lab to kick the tires, so to speak, to make sure that that it was all okay. But the amount of money they required would be very modest. Venture research is very cheap. So people talk about high risk, low reward, you know, which is just madness. Why anybody should support high risk research, why the funding agencies should support high risk research, to me, is just mad. Why should anybody support you if they expect you to fail?
Exactly.
So with venture research, it's low risk, high reward. The risk doesn't enter into it. We don't even think about the word risk. That's what scientists do. They take risk, you know, and every time. But they're expected to look into the future, when usually the vision of the future is limited to a few days. You know, if they're doing decent research, you know, that is research that really does meet our criteria. So to ask them to, a few years ago, they asked researchers to say, what would happen in 50 years. They very soon changed that, of course, because they realized it was utterly ridiculous.
That's great. I really like that framing. So, Don, you mentioned how cheap venture research is. How much do you think it would cost to set up a similar operation today, like the one you did in the 90s with BP?
Well, it would the costs would be the same. The cost of research have gone up, of course, so that but each project would be no more than $100,000 a year, and if you had a small team, say if BP or Exxon or Rush or any of the big companies were to set up a venture research activity, then it would cost them about 20 million over 10 years. Sorry, that's 20 million what it cost BP. That was in 1980, so that might be 50 million now. So, but we're talking about tiny amounts of money for big companies, and it does, and the benefit to them is enormous. I mean, the benefit to BP in the 80s was astronomical. Their recruitment went up, their reputation in the universities, because we were supporting these radical guys, all went up. It was a win-win situation, and it was only the political situation that you adumbrated at the end that cost us. That we had there was a managing director at BP, and we had him for this is after Jack Burks. We had Jack Burks for 2 years, but then he retired, and he was succeeded by somebody, the name escapes me for the minute, a senior moment. And he was succeeded by a managing director who I can't imagine how he got to his position. He was just stupid. And he didn't agree with anything we were doing. And one day I got a call. He was on a trip to New Zealand, and I was told to be at my desk at 9 o'clock because Basil Butler would call me, and he closed down the unit. He said, BP can no longer afford the drain on its resources. This is it was just so ridiculous. Why didn't you go to Shell? He said. I mean, it was just utterly ridiculous. So I said, well, if you think that venture research is worthless, why don't you give it to me? Well, that put the cat among the pigeons, as they say. So I worked on that, and I went to see the managing director, who'd been in loco parentis, so to speak, who'd been charged with looking after me while Basil Butler swanned around the world. And he said, I don't agree with what Mr. Butler has done. I don't agree with the closure of the venture research activity, because you are the most sophisticated organization in BP. You get the most value for money, the most bang for buck. And I think that was the reason that closed us, that the research director and Basil Butler got to put their heads together, decided I had to be stopped because I would undermining, peer review, for example. Peer review was rubbish, which it is. It's all right when, if peer review works most of the time very well. I mean, it's not universally bad. It's just that it never works for people who are wanting to radically change the way we think. Then it's maximally wrong. But for most research, for what most people do, it's actually fine. It works well. But most scientists privately criticize it for the same reason I do. I've lost my thread again. They criticize it. What was I talking about?
Good. About peer review and why scientists
peer
criticize
review.
it.
Yeah. I've lost my thread.
Well, Don, let me redirect you just a little bit and see if you remember Stephen Davies that started Oxford Asymmetry.
Oh, I remember him very well.
Could you use him as an example, like economically? I'm not sure what it costs to support his project initially, but Oxford Asymmetry was bought for 312 million pounds when it went public. Does that sound reasonable?
Oh, it's good. It's right. It's accurate. Yes, that can be checked.
And so, do you have any idea about how much it took to fund his initial research and start what he did?
Well, I've just said that the venture research was about then it was about 50,000 a year, so about between 50 and 150 and 200,000 pounds over 3 years. And we supported him for 6 years, or even 9 years. I can't remember. He was renewed several times. So it was. It is a massive, profitable activity. At UCL, by the way, we haven't spoken about UCL. I set up a venture activity in UCL with the backing of the Vice Provost. And in 2008, we've had one proposal. We've had 50 applications about, and this one proposal has cost £150,000 over 3 years. This was a largely theoretical study. This is today, today. But since 2008, Nick Lane, the person who was involved, has attracted £5 million of external funding.
Oh, wow.
I mean, it is if any demonstration is needed of the value of venture research, currently, because BP is 1980s, this is now. He's now working at UCL when he can get into the lab, that is.
Right, exactly.
Which isn't very often, of course.
So, Don, that's really interesting. And you talked a little bit about your work at UCL with venture research. What do you think the next 15 years, 10 years, 5 years look like for venture research across the world? And I know you've talked to Stripe, Patrick Collison a little bit about the practice, but is it just attracting more people, more funders to follow this approach, or what does that look like for you?
Well, there's been that I haven't come across a surfeit of funders. I still get the odd idea, from UCL. I get the odd proposal. I just finished one just a few weeks ago, but it wasn't venture research, and so it requires somebody. My vision for the future. You ask about what's your vision for venture research for the future. I would like to see, because I'm now getting on a bit. I would like to see individual universities appoint someone to look at their universities' candidates for this, invite proposals from them. Now, it would support, maybe one proposal in 10 years, as we've done at UCL. And this may not impress a lot of people. If the annual spend is 0, you're not going to be very impressed, are you? Right. But the process is exciting, because each person you get a proposal from, you don't know whether it's going to be the next Einstein. You don't, the odds aren't very high, but you don't know that. So you have to look at every proposal, and then, you never say no to anybody. You always say, but what about X, or what about Y? And then listen to their responses. So I hope that a few universities in the UK, a few in the US, a few elsewhere, would set up their own activities. The senior people, he would be very senior probably, but they would give them carte blanche to derive their own rules, but as long as it didn't use peer review or consensus or any of the fashionable ways of doing it now, and then look for completely new initiatives. because there must be lots of them. I mean, we understand very little, actually. I mentioned that peer review works very well when the knowledge base is sound. But look what's happening now. You've got we understand only less than 5% of what's going on in the universe. We don't know what to do about gravity. We don't know about consciousness very much. We don't origin of life, which is Nick Lane's thing, is still primitive. So it makes no sense, therefore, for research councils, for funding agencies to set priorities, because there's so much we don't know.
I really like that. I really, Don, this has been really quite interesting. David, do you have any other questions?
I could sit here and talk to Don all morning about some of this, but I'm just impressed. I'm impressed by, it seems like a lot of the problem is the bureaucracies that get involved with research and sort of inhibit it.
Yeah, bureaucracy is the killer. Scientists have always had to deal with bureaucracy, but when we had the system before 1970, they weren't too bothered by it, because they could get on with what they wanted to do. I mean, they might be regarded by their colleagues as nutters, no doubt Max Planck was regarded for a long time before he came up with his major discovery. Even then, Planck didn't believe. Planck was so amazed by his discovery that he didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. It was so bizarre that energy should be quantized. That's just not make any sense at all. So bureaucracy would, if bureaucracy had been able to strangle what Max Planck was doing at birth, it would have done so. It would have crushed his, he would have had to be extremely determined to resist the external pressures on him if they had been organized. And that's what bureaucracy needs, organizing always, of course. So we want to set up a situation where scientists, serious scientists, can think about what in their field, what are the major problems and how are we going about solving it? And that will then lead them through a new theoretical element, maybe, to new ways of proposed new ways of doing things. It is not easy, though. It's not easy to select such people. But I say you have to talk to them and keep on talking to them until you convinced that they would be a good bet, a safe bet.
Don, there seems to be a parallel between even today, we needed a vaccine for the coronavirus and turned it over to scientists, and in less than 12 months, they've come up with these beautiful vaccines. But now the bureaucracy doesn't seem to be able to get it into people's arms.
Yeah, well, that is impressive. It is impressive. And I think they've used Blue Skies research, over the last 20 years to design these mRNA virus antidotes. And it is impressive.
That's great. So, Don, do you have any parting thoughts? And where should people find your work if they want to read more? I know you have a book out with Stripe Press. It's excellent. That's actually where David and I found your work.
You've seen the book, have you?
Yes, we actually both read it. It's excellent.
You've both read it. Well, there's one after that, which is called Promoting the Planck Club. Have you seen that?
We have not read that one yet.
You haven't read that one. Well, that's really the story of Max Planck et al. The story of physicists in the first 20 years of the 20th century was just remarkable. I mean, they had disputes galore, because but they were all working together to solve the problem of quantum mechanics. This problem has still not been solved, of course, as everyone knows. It goes on and on. It is an amazing story. And I only hope that there will be some people in some university. It only takes one other, maybe. It always takes one person in any organization who has influence to recognize that what we're saying, it makes serious sense. And it doesn't, they must protect that organization because, the Basil Butlers of this world are always willing to pop up and screw you, So you've got to have some sort of an undertaking from an organization that it will support you come what may, because the cost is so small.
That's right. And then the rewards are quite high as well.
And the rewards are astronomical. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Don, any other parting words? I really want to thank you for coming on. I've learned quite a bit. I'm sure, David, you have as well. And we really enjoyed your book. I'll include a link to the book where you can purchase it in the podcast notes for everyone.
Well, I've enjoyed it too. I'm a bit incoherent at times, but put that down to age.
Well, thank you, Don.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Will. And David, thank you very much too.
Thanks, Don.
Adios.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.